Well, welcome everybody to September's session of Reading Pilgrimage Together. This month, we'll be talking about Dawn's Left Hand, book 10 in the series. And our special guest is Dr. Crescent Rainwater from the University of Mercer University in Macon, Georgia. But before we start the discussion, let's go into the usual administrative remarks here. So if I can just go to that for a second. So we've been talking over this year about pilgrimage through mainly through Twitter using the Pilgrimage Together hashtag. We also have the Reading Pilgrimage site where I've been posting material for each volume, as well as kind of illuminatory information about Richardson and pilgrimage and reactions to things at that time. So we're in September with Dawn's Left Hand, well into volume 4, with just 3 more books to go in the novel, or volume chapters, as Richardson liked to have them referred to. And looking ahead, we're going to shift because of the school holidays in the UK. We're going to have our next session the first week of November on the 3rd, talking about Clear Horizon with Dr. Max Saunders. And then at the end of that month, talk about Dimple Hill with Dr. Annika Lindskog. And then the plan is to have a session in January where we kind of both talk about March Moonlight and do an omnibus wrap up of the pilgrimage series as a whole. So today we're talking about Dawn's Left Hand, book 10, first published in 1931. And this is in the period where Richardson is sort of struggling just to make ends meet and get time to write on pilgrimage as opposed to all the other things. So at this point, she's doing reviewing, she's doing translations, she's doing various odd jobs and living a bare existence with her husband, Alan Ottle. So with that, let me stop sharing and turn the mic over to Dr. Crescent Rainwater, who will talk to us today about Dawn's Left Hand. Crescent, please.
Thank you so much, Brad. So it is just a delight to be with all of you today. I was so excited when I heard from Brad and somebody else that was just very excited about pilgrimage, so excited that there was enough dedication to put this whole thing together, which is actually really remarkable. I'm just so impressed. This amazing experience for all of us from these different parts of the world. And also all the resources you've collected are really impressive and fascinating. So I'm just excited to be here with you all today. So my sort of first encounter with Richardson was when I was doing my PhD and I was starting to think about what I was going to write my dissertation on. And I was just reading a lot of women novelists, and my advisor said, oh, there's this author, Dorothy Richardson, you should really check out her writing. And I started reading Pointed Roofs, and I thought, have I ever read anything that is this captivating? Just the style, the technique, the beauty of the writing. I could see every single thing this character was experiencing. And I realized like the way that I kind of am aware of my own consciousness, the way that Miriam was aware of hers, and the language sort of applied to that just was so compelling. So I have been reading her since then. And Dawn's Left Hand is of course, really intriguing novel, given the different culmination of some of the themes that happen in this particular chapter volume. So I have some topics that I think are, of course, crucial to this chapter volume that I'd like us to discuss. And my plan is to really just introduce a topic, give a little bit of grounding in a couple passages, say a few comments, and then open it up to then having us engage with looking at a passage together and doing some discussion, and then kind of move on to another kind of crucial aspect of the plot and or the themes, and then kind of see where we're at from there. But to start with, it really strikes me that this novel really kind of overlaps with the previous one, including in the way that Oberlin itself ends. There's this anticipation of her return to London. And then once she's back in London, she's kind of aware of carrying Oberlin and its experiences with her in a way that's really significant. And I think we see something similar happen when she comes back to London when she's been in Hanover. And the way that she sort of filters experience sometimes through these moments and these experiences from Hanover. And so I thought just drawing our attention to some of the like end of Oberlin that's bringing us to anticipate the way that Miriam's starting to anticipate that her London life is going to be somewhat changed and revised in a way by this experience. And so if we look at, I have the Dent edition with the 4 final chapter volumes in here.
Yeah, let me just mention, I think everybody, the majority of folks are reading the Virago Modern Classics, which very fortunately has exactly the same pagination.
Wonderful.
So,
okay, that's very helpful. Okay.
Most of folks, there's a few, I think, who are obtaining it volume by volume, but yeah, the great thing is that the Dent
Oh dear, Brad, I think we've lost you.
Oh, are others of you here? I wasn't sure if I was paused or if you were all paused.
We're here.
Okay. Oh, okay, good. It's like, oh no. Well, I suppose I can keep talking. Does that seem okay? Hopefully Brad will join us again. All right. So it strikes me that also London and Hypo are kind of merged in this passage in Oberlin on page 123, the final paragraph here. In London was Hypo held up at any rate, saying he was held up, and not now so much awaiting her decision as taking it for granted. A big shadow that might turn into sunshine, a gleaming shadow that lost its brightness as she faced it. And behind it, a world perhaps took most of its glamour from this uncertain shadow. So I think this is really preparing us to think about Hypo and what she's anticipating her return to London, that he stands kind of as this shadow almost, that has this potential to become something that's full of light, which I'm sure you've talked about, like the significance of light in Pilgrimage up to this point. So really the way that she's linking these two concepts and her anticipation and the potential that we have there. So I wanted us to kind of remember that that's happening before we've moved into Dawn's Left Hand. And also on page 125, again, the way that London has sort of already asserted itself in the middle of the page, the hours ahead became a superfluous time to be spent in a Switzerland whose charm, since London had reached forth and touched her, had fallen into its future place as part of life, an embellishment, a golden joy to which she would return. And then when we get into, that's the final chapter of Oberlin. And then we don't actually start with her already being in London when we are in Dawn's Left Hand. So I think it feels very deliberate to me that there's this, London is creeping in and we're still not returned to London when Dawn's Left Hand opens. And a particular moment for me that really encapsulates the way she's linking these two things is on page 168, and which is preceding the Wagner concert, which I'm actually going to have us kind of not pause on yet, but perhaps hopefully we'll have time at the end. But she's in a cab and she thinks, in the dark interior of the cab, part of London's Oberland, linking its sacred spaces, Hypo and Alma became once more fellow adventurers, reduced to simplicity by the prospect of being submissive items in the community of a London audience. So this London's Oberland, thought maybe I'd just be interested to hear, was that something that kind of piqued the curiosity of anyone else, or were there other ways that you thought that this kind of merging of experiences was significant, and what did you make of this London's Oberland?
Hi. I did notice it, and I was wondering because she refers to Oberland as more of a just like a state of mind, and so I was interested, though I hadn't necessarily reached any conclusions, but I was interested in what exactly she meant by, an Oberland state of mind. And the only, like, some of the things I thought about were maybe just like a kind of a security, like that she associated Switzerland with a feeling of, I would say, prosperousness, but I think prosperousness not so much in like monetary, but just the feeling of security and confidence. So that was what I was thinking.
Okay, yeah, I think that definitely rings true. What were some things you said about kind of who Miriam is in Oberland, the space of Oberland, when you had your discussion last time? Were there any kind of, I don't know, ways that you characterized her or noticed her being kind of different in when she's in Oberland? I think what you're saying, Karen, would lead to us thinking that there's a sense of security, a sense of, and is it a security in herself? Is it a kind of like acceptance of self that we're seeing, or?
Well, I wasn't sure exactly about in Oberland, but I do notice that she refers to Oberlanders and Oberland a lot in this book. And I pulled out some stuff near the end, like on page 252, when she's kind of reviewing her life. And she talks about the Coreys and the Orleys, Mr. Hancock, and the majority of their patients, and all kinds of Oberlanders. And then, but the old world people, newly dear since Oberland, can be lived with only at the cost of pretending to think as they do, not to think, but to live entirely in reference to tradition and code. Sooner or later, they discover that you belong mentally elsewhere, as well as to them, and you become an object of suspicion.
Yes, very good. So she's able to categorize them very easily, is something I get from that. She seems to understand them, and she doesn't have to pretend to be like them. But what things, Phyllis, were you the one who was speaking? Was there more that you would kind of want to draw out from that passage?
Well, just a little bit of the sense that maybe Oberland was the first time that she did get out of London, so that she could start to see herself and see her place in London when she gets back.
Okay, yes, that's very good. Good.
It's also a time of freedom, isn't it, for her? I think, that sense of, I mean, she's on holiday for a start, and in that there's that fantastic scene on the toboggan where she, has one of those episodes like on the slide in the earlier volume, that, or on her bicycle, where speed seems to be a big thing for her, and to be, to be a sign of freedom, and then, and she nearly gets into some kind of relationship with the man she's talking to there, and all of that seems to kind of prepare her mentally for what happens in Dawn's Left Hand, I think.
Yes. Okay. Yes. So yes, I think a lot of what we see in her in this chapter volume is really enabled by that experience and that encounter, and her own awareness that she's carrying it with her. So maybe we can kind of keep that in the back of our minds as we proceed to unpack some of the most crucial relationships that are in this volume. So of course, she's already associated London and her return with Hypo. And that gets reinforced on page 141 when she's looking at his very short letter. "Welcome to your London, my dear. I'm more in love with you than ever." And the next few lines or sections I want to read as well. She kind of analyzes his writing. "When she reached the small interwoven capitals forming the signature, she felt herself returned from flight, unawares, towards a far distance, and felt the strong beating of her heart quieten before a vision of this shapely device, so deftly continuing and completing the design of the written lines, set down in a kind of sincerity beneath innumerable documents such as this. He was in love, in his way, once again. But behind the magic words was nothing for her individually, for anyone individually. And his brilliance, the mental qualities she had hitherto found so full of charm, had somehow unaccountably become overshadowed. She no longer felt the importance of trying to find forms of expression for alternative interpretations of his overpowering collection of facts. She felt at this moment that any interpretation was preferable to his, and no plan at all better than even the most workable of plans born of the assumptions science was helplessly forced to make. He was offering a stone, a precious stone, but there might be bread waiting hidden in the world, whose approaching distances seemed no longer filled only with queer, irregular people who held most others in scorn. So I see here a very decisive kind of response where she's no longer, or she's not sort of under any kind of, what does this man actually want? Does he actually, what are his feelings toward me? But she can now say, behind the magic words was nothing for her individually. And I think we're seeing that she's no longer seeing Hypo as potentially a threat to her kind of personhood, her autonomy. I don't know that she ever necessarily did fully, but I think here it's very definitive and clear that he is not, he's not going to threaten that aspect of herself, and that she potentially, this is why she can allow for the risk of having sex with him later in the volume. So I think that's important. So we have these words, "I love you." And that, of course, we get that from another character. So I want to kind of hold that in our minds, and what being in love with her here means in comparison with the later instance. And this detachment that we see here is also echoed on page 178, when she thinks this person, she's talking about herself, who is about to take a lover presently in time, at the right time. And there's just this sense of detachment. She's very much kind of, I guess I'm going to do this, and that she's not excited about it, perhaps, but more like a new experience to kind of add to her accumulation of experiences. So that we kind of get all of these things, and then we have Amabel enter the novel, or the chapter novel. And I want to just pause there and just think, see if there were other thoughts that you had, kind of the way that Hypo's being set up and her connection to him prior to this other figure entering the story, and kind of, bringing with her all sorts of unexpected experiences and feelings. Other things to say about Hypo in this?
Well, I think one thing that seems to me is that I mean, this may be literature's least romantic affair of all time. Her motivation of going into it seems to be as minimal as possible. I mean, there's a scene where after they're in the restaurant in the private room, that they go to Donizetti's, and she honestly seems to have more of a relationship with Donizetti than with Hypo, even though she admits she doesn't actually even know if the man's name is Donizetti.
Yes, yeah, no, I think that's true. It's a striking difference. Okay, yeah.
I think also this volume, what I really was struck by was how often Miriam is now really, verbalizing, or at least Richardson is verbalizing, I guess you would say, for Miriam, her differentness from other people. I mean, that the scene in the train station where she's looking around and she says that the great station, the secret joy palpitated in the exciting metal-smelling air like the beating of wings. It emanated even from those who were setting out deedily, and I love that word, deedily, only for the suburbs, and reached and transformed every hideous object within their sight. So she's looking at people, basically commuters, and kind of saying, well, they have to kind of like program themselves into a mindset to do this kind of routine, and she realizes that that's not how she wants to live her life. And Hypo is the same sort of thing. She's kind of assessing him and saying, well, he's got this, and this, but overall there's a limit, there's a border, and he's not ever going to cross that border.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, then she also soon thereafter goes and decides that Densley isn't really for her either, right?
Yes.
And
Right.
she the Celtic shape of his voice, I guess it means he has a Scottish accent. He had a brave time, dear girl. I couldn't imagine her spending time with somebody who talked like that. But I mean, I love it, but I don't think she does. And well, I'm going to get off on maybe you're going to talk about this later, but the oral references in this book are amazing. I mean, there are so many different sounds. And like deedily, very odd adjectives used to characterize them. And then she gets off into, which she's done before, mocking people's accents and actually phonetically transcribing it with the umlaut O for the the British accents. And then she touches this a little bit in her descriptions of Hypo's handwriting, but that 4 or 5 paragraph description of Amabel's letter with no margins, and the words open up inside the pen strokes, and it's almost like Dorothy wants to write like that. I mean, and she is. I mean, it's almost like you see her writing in her head while she's describing it, which I've never experienced before. But and then she talks about how Egypt is the ugliest word in the world because of all the tales that get tangled. And then I realized how few of us ever have correspondence in handwriting anymore, right? And she's fascinated by handwriting. It tells her so much. Sort of like phrenology, it's like this, how someone's nose looks is going to tell you whether they're noble or not, So that's, well, yeah.
Yes, that's great. Very good. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, the Densley thing, of course, it's, he seems like a more traditional, right? He's a more traditional potential mate. But she does not want that. He starts talking about honeymoons, right? And that thought is unappealing to her. But I want to kind of, since it feels like we have a lot of time, but we don't really, kind of move on to some of these passages with Amabel, and really start thinking about the difference. I mean, it's just this utter contrast with how she relates to Hypo, and it's very fascinating. So we first see her on page 174 at the start of chapter 5. And Miriam's about to depart, and we learn that on her way to the door, Miriam was pulled up by the voice of a woman who had turned from a small group standing close at hand, hatless residents. The voice had an eager, anxious, apologetic sound, and gave her exit the air of royalty and procession, graciously halted to accept a petition. Turning in the gloom, hardly lessened at this end of the long room by the switching on of a distant shaded light, she saw only a dim outline, a pale oval of face saluting her, obliquely down tilted above a gown glowing silky rose red through the dusk, in which the forms of the other women showed no color. Here was charm, some strange grace and charm that was defying the warning voice within. So kind of many things there. Again, the voice, exactly, she's picking up on the sound, the eager, apologetic sound. And it's really intriguing that inside of her is a warning voice, right? There's something sort of mysterious, engaging, perhaps, right? She's already thinking about the potential that this person can have to kind of take her off of her course, I guess, right? She's about to depart. So then we get a little bit more detail to continue in that passage. The figure, assuming as she confronted it, a fresh attitude of graceful pleading, had now a level face whose eyes were smiling recognition, patiently, reproachfully, a much tried adorer, who yet was making allowances for too long an instant being forced to prompt and wait for an answering recognition. Inwardly protesting her extreme unrelatedness to this person, moving so elegantly from pose to pose, yet attracted by the unaccountable glow, as if the rose-red gown shone for her in the gloom by its own light, and held by a curious intensity of being in the alien figure, Miriam waited unresponsive. So to me, this description seems pretty unique in the way that Miriam seems kind of overcome by this person's appearance. She's not immediately kind of categorizing her or able to dismiss her with like a kind of witty sketch, right? It's a much different type of response that she's feeling, this inward protest and this attraction to this glow, and as if it's for her, right? So there's something very personal and maybe almost dangerous about the immediate feeling of being drawn to this person, that just is sort of rather striking. And then we get her, the fact that the next time we see her is Miriam playing the piano, which, as we know all the way back from Pointed Roofs, for Miriam to playing and music is one of the most sort of exalted experiences, and where she has many of these like epiphanic moments, the epiphanies about existence, and so I think it's not an accident that this person is coming into this space in which she's creating music. So she comes in and listens to her play the piano. We hear on page 188 that Miriam is admiring the girl's open appreciation of her own beauty at this moment newly created for her in eyes into which she gazed as into a mirror. So I want to hold on to that description, and then also add to it the one on page 190. And if somebody would like to read it, because I don't need to read every single one, the top of page 90, the 2 paragraphs, they are now talking to one another. There's the first 2 full paragraphs on top of page 190.
Does anybody want to jump in and pick that one up? It starts, yes, you are English.
Yes, thank you, Brad.
Yes, I'm happy to do that if
All right,
anyone
exactly.
else
Thank
wants to.
you. Thank you, Max.
Yes, you are English. That is the strange thing, she remarked in a polite, judicial tone. And so different, she added, head sideways with an adoring smile and a low voice thrilling with emotion. Her hands came forward, one before the other, outstretched, very gently approaching. And while Miriam read in the girl's eyes the reflection of her own motionless yielding, the hands moved apart, and it was the lovely face that touched her first, suddenly and softly dropped upon her knees that now were gently clasped on either side by the small hands. Alone with the strange burden, confronting empty space, Miriam supposed she ought to stroke the hair, but was withheld, held, unbreathing in a quietude of well-being that was careless of her own demand for some outward response. She felt complete as she was, brooding apart in an intensity of being that flowed refreshingly through all her limbs and went from her in a radiance that seemed to exist for herself alone and could not be apparent to the hidden girl.
Thank you, Max. This is like just a remarkable kind of scene when I try to picture this interaction, right? This woman who leans in and touches Miriam with her own face. I mean, this is very intimate. They barely know each other. And this reaction that it brings out of Miriam about her own self. So I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on what's kind of going on here, or what were you thinking or feeling as you read this scene?
Well, two things that struck me in that is there's 2 words that are kind of really crucial that Richardson uses consistently throughout the book. And one is the complete, that very often it's like the experience Miriam is seeking, or the ones that she kind of most relishes, are the ones where she feels complete. Because very often interactions with other people, she effectively feels stereotyped or misunderstood. So feeling complete is really exceptional. And then the other one is that magic word radiance, which is all over the place in the book. When we had our discussion with the folks in Tasmania in May, and they brought up the point that radiance is really such a critical word in pilgrimage. And from that point on, my eye is picking every radiance out and highlighting it. And so it's an interesting reaction where she is really, responding on a level. It's almost, to me, it's like in this book, she has hypo and she has Amabel, and it's like she's only dealt with, it's like she's only ever gone to 2D movies, and now she has 3D glasses. And she's like, whoa, this is a completely, there's another dimension to these relations, to a relationship. And hypo can't measure up. He's 2D.
Yes. Very good.
Another thing with
sorry, no, you go ahead.
I was just going to say about those 2 words. I totally agree with you, Brad, on that. But another thing that seems to indicate that Miriam is in a good place is when her limbs get warm. And and I guess that comes from living in not very well heated houses, but her limbs warm up a lot when she's happy.
I was just going to say that it's very striking that those two terms are almost contradictory, aren't they? The kind of radiance and the complete. I mean, this is a scene where in anyone else's novel it would be the kind of the coming together of the two people that produces the radiance, but for Miriam, it's holding the other person at arm's length that does it. So it's a classic Miriam moment, isn't it? And it's the same with Hypo as well. You know that she starts having the relationship, but then she wants to kind of hold him off in some way, and it's, you know, and that seems to be, I mean, by now it's becoming a very familiar pattern, isn't it, that she actually feels freer sort of on her own rather than locked into a situation where other people are making demands or expectations on her of some kind.
Yes, that is very Miriam.
The other comment I wanted to offer was that observation early in the chapter that you read, Crescent. I put a note. I'm reading this on a tablet, which is nice because I can mark up all the pages without destroying a book. But I wrote down Henry James, because very often, you know, Miriam is as observing other people, but she rarely like stops the narration to just focus on one person for a paragraph, going kind of detail by detail. And so it was, I don't know whether that's because, you know, I guess it was a couple of books back that she reads The Ambassadors and is exposed to James's approach. But, you know, that kind of thing that people either love or hate in James, which is when everything stops to focus, you know, on a character in such, you know, minute detail, observing actions. I mean, it seems to me, I mean, I might be completely off base here, but it seems to me like Richardson, you know, writes impressions, and she rarely actually creates a whole character the way she does in that paragraph, trying to start creating a character. So to me, it just seemed like you don't actually get this too much in Pilgrimage.
Yes, absolutely. So want to look at a couple of more passages as this progresses, and just noting that, right, I kind of said it very quickly, but that early on she sees that the girl is also, that Amabel's admiring her, and she actually acknowledges, like Miriam acknowledges her own beauty, which is a kind of unusual thing. Like Miriam's awareness of her own appearance, of her body, is very limited. And that becomes much more pronounced in particular moments here. And yes, Karen pointing out how the eye emerges exactly. There are very particular moments that are significant, and where we can kind of see that the first person, why it's emerging in this kind of self-realization or acknowledgement. So it's maybe almost too obvious of a thing to talk about, but it's sort of remarkable that the first time that Miriam reads Amabel's writing is when she's looking at herself in her own mirror, right? So
you mean when she sees "I love you"?
Exactly. So
right.
Let's see, where is that passage? 196 to 7. And it's starting at the top of the page with that single line, that just one word paragraph of freedom. That is where we're at before it proceeds into this description. And it's kind of a lengthy passage, but does anybody mind reading basically the whole rest of that page? I think it's really significant and a lot to unpack that would be useful for us to read together.
Anybody want to jump in and read that one? Page 196, starting with freedom.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm happy to read it.
Thank you,
if you
Karen.
like. Okay, starting with the first freedom or the second freedom? The first
Let's do
one.
both. Yeah.
Okay. Freedom. Freedom for thought when it made its sudden visits, to expand unhampered by the awful suggestions coming from the Flaxman surroundings, to sit down unobserved and endlessly free from interruption at this little bureau that now could fulfill the promise for which it was bought. She became aware of her framed mirror on the wall behind her, reflecting in its narrow length her form seated in the shadowy candlelight she was so soon to leave for the cheerful blaze of gas, or the steady companionship of the reading lamp that at Flaxman's she had hardly used at all, and half turned to look into it and exchange over her shoulder a smile of congratulation with her reflected image. The glass was not clear. Across her face that should have shone in the reflected candlelight was some kind of cloudy blur. Holding up the candle, she found lettering, large and twirly, thickly outlined, as if made with chalk or moist putty, moving with a downward slope across the center of the strip of glass. Mystified, for who in the wide world could have had access to her room, or achieving it, should be moved to deface her mirror in a manner suggesting it was for sale, and disturbed by the unaccountable presence that had been silently witnessing, unpardonably mocking. It seemed to her as she pushed away the chair and stood aside to let the candlelight fall upon the strange apparition, her private rejoicings. I love you, it said. With the feeling of coming down and down from a faraway upper distance, a physical sensation of rhythmic descent down and down, her consciousness arrived in the moment and paused, looking out through the eyes of her body at the shadowy semblance left in the room. The figure of the girl secretly and swiftly coming and going in outdoor garb, cloak or loose coat, something swaying and flowing with her movements, un-Englishly. She must have discovered the address at the club, come round here on an impulse, and immediately encountered Selina. Selina in her old dressing gown and with a candle guttering in her battered candlestick, peering out into the darkness, a little suspicious of the foreign voice and the poses and the extraordinary request that must have followed their brief conversation. Or perhaps already dressed for her evening lecture and therefore feeling relatively sporting and daredevil and at once won over, preceding her upstairs and admitting her for a moment to this room, alone. Candle and coming in to blow it out again after she had shown her downstairs. With a swift blush, while she assured herself that in the dim light she would not have observed it, she wondered whether Selina had seen the writing on the mirror.
Wonderful. Right. So there's obviously a lot to unpack here, but what was some of the things that struck you about this scene? And that, so I think this is one of the most crucial for me passages in all of the volume. So what are some thoughts?
Well, just a comment that experience she describes of down and down and then repeating it down and down. That the descent ties to me back to Oberlin, where, I think it's important to remember she had never in her life experienced mountains,
Right.
altitudes and these great, descents of, and so that just feeling yourself going down and down kind of ties back to she has had an experience of, vast different distances and things like that she would never have gotten at any point up until the time that she went to Switzerland.
That's a great point. Yeah, good.
That's really interesting. If I could add to that, because I've been noticing both the down movements, but also in other places, the up movements, and often going up the stairs into her attic and her room. And there's quite a lot in this imagery. It's quite Jungian and it's quite alchemical, because there's a sort of alchemy of transformation, which Carl Jung writes a lot about, which involves going down into the darkness and then coming up into the light. And I guess this passage that we're looking at here is part of that alchemical kind of transformation she's going through in this process of realizing herself.
Yes.
So what you said, Brad, it's nice to link it with the external experience of the mountains as well.
Absolutely. Especially since, we know, as we started the discussion, she's brought Oberlin back with her. And that's a great way that she's not explicitly invoking Oberlin, but absolutely the ability to kind of express that experience. I think that's a wonderful connection. Yeah.
Karen, given your mention of alchemy, there's also a moment where she's talking about Hypo, how he would understand that discovery about oneself is impersonal as well as personal, like a discovery in chemistry,
Yes.
which she's doing her own alchemy, right? That's what it sounds like. Okay, good, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for reminding me of that. I remember noticing that.
No, I like the Jungian stuff too. That's one of the few stuffs that I like for literature to be used for.
Well, that's really such a striking, to me, that was such a striking observation that, essentially when you're observing yourself, it is both personal and impersonal.
Well, that's where I hate to say this, and this is probably totally off. I keep getting this whole existential thing going on and phenomenology going on, and the act of observing how that changes you and what you observe. And, Heidegger, Husserl, and Hegel, and who gosh knows what.
There's a piece that I came across from 1950 that I've queued up. It'll come out on the site in October, where it's interesting. Basically it's an article called "What is Stream of Consciousness?" And the writer devotes a fair amount of time to Richardson, and he ends up arguing that Richardson actually isn't stream of consciousness. He calls it, and I won't get the word right, but it was like sensory illumination or something like that, sensory impressionism, where in fact he describes that Richardson stands along the street beside the stream of consciousness, observing it and pulling out sensory impressions, but not actually putting you in the stream, which is, I don't know, I'm going to have to think about that one for a while because there's a lot to unpack.
Well, that's the old Heisenberg uncertainty principle, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I think Richardson would appreciate that. Have you spoken about how she didn't like the term stream of consciousness? Has that already come up?
Brad posted, I think, some stuff about that. I'm not sure we talked about it, but we have.
We talked about a little with Rebecca Bowler early on, because Rebecca is a big May Sinclair expert, and of course May Sinclair was the first one to make that connection of the two, Richardson and stream of consciousness.
Right. Yes. Which, when you're trying to convince somebody of Richardson's relevance, one thing you can sort of do to quickly sort of get them to see is to say, well, she's the first one to whom this term was applied, because people sort of universally think, oh, that's like an important, development in literature. But to think that, yes, she herself did not see her writing as being fitting, that was a fitting description. So I think
I wanted to bring up something else that had come up in the chat, because we talked about it a little bit last month. which is we start to notice a lot more shifts from third person to first person.
Yes.
Very, just from sentence to sentence, you just
Mhm.
shift and then shift back out.
Mhm.
And apparently nobody has really like focused on that as, what is that, why is Richardson doing that? But it's quite as, I mean, we're all trying to figure out when the first time that happens in pilgrimage is.
Oh, I know
uh,
when it is.
Oh,
Or
okay,
I
great.
can, I have to look it up, but I have detailed notes about it in the first volumes. Let me see if I can pull it up. But what was I also going to say? There is the one account I have read that does actually make a lot of the use of first person, and especially does link it to the fact that it's happening in this volume quite frequently, is a reading that really wants to say that that Miriam is a lesbian character, and that her connection with Amabel is the thing that seems to spark this increase of the use of the first person.
Is that Joanne winning?
Yes. Mhm.
Yes. Okay, great.
So her argument is she ties it in some points very significantly to the increased use of the first person voice. Now, I myself think that that's too narrow of a reading. I don't think Miriam can be kind of restricted to one particular kind of sexuality. And in fact, I think she's more erotic about music and hair and things than she is about with Hypo, which we haven't quite gotten to that moment yet, right? But like she says, like his body is unattractive. Like sometimes she can feel attracted to him when his clothes are on, but it's like it's kind of maybe makes sense that when it actually finally happens, they're in a dark room where she can't see him, right? Like he has to creep into the bed and she's not seeing him. But it strikes me that Pointed Roofs, I mean, those moments where she's watching the girl's hair and she's listening to the music and everything, to me, those are much more erotic moments than many of the interactions she has, especially with her male suitors. So I think it's right to sort of say like, no, she's not categorically like necessarily just heterosexual or something. But I think her eroticism is more interesting than just having one kind of object of desire. But onto the first person, back to the first person. Just trying to see if I could find it. Maybe I'll try to find it while we continue to talk, because I don't want to. But we'll get there.
Could I add something to the conversation about stream of consciousness?
Absolutely.
Yes.
I thought one of the wonderful moments in the passage we were just looking at is when she says her consciousness arrived in the moment and paused, which is just after that kind of toboggan rush of going down and down. And so it sort of both is and isn't stream of consciousness, isn't it? I mean, it's about her consciousness and what it's perceiving, but what it's perceiving isn't in the moment like it probably would have to be in classic stream of consciousness. It's darting around and stepping back from that and taking a kind of panoramic view of it as well.
Yes, that's excellent. So I did actually find my note first. So it first comes into the narrative all the way back in Pointed Roofs, and Miriam has been thinking about, let's see, she's with her father and she's contemplating asking him a question. And she thinks if only he would answer a question simply and not with a superior air. And so she's in this talk with him, and she starts reflecting on she's kind of the differences between men and women. And the first time she says I am unsociable, I suppose. I don't like men and I loathe women. I am a misanthrope. That's the very first time that first person comes into the whole narrative.
Amazing.
Yes. So
what a telling comment to tie it to as well.
Mm-hmm.
and that is so relevant, because in a way that captures almost one of the essences of the whole journey. Yes. That she's exploring conventional men, conventional women, how she relates to them. And of course, that comes back in Dawn's Left Hand, where she has that moment and she can almost imagine being one of these conventional women that she'd never really understood before. That's such a powerful moment. And somehow the I that emerges is not a conventional gender of any type. It's a real voice, a genderless voice, or all genders are in it. So it's amazing. That's the first time it happened in Pointed Roofs. That's so relevant, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's
Great.
Yes. Yes. Of course, my favorite instance of the I is when she's reading Ouida and Backwater.
Yeah.
And she just declares, "I am older than anyone in this house. I am myself." And of course, that's to me, that's another connection where eroticism for Miriam, it's very pointedly a woman writer who she's reading at this moment, and she has a very erotic connection to those novels. And I think again here in Dawn's Left Hand, we're seeing a level of responsiveness, fascination, and very distinctly in this passage that we were just looking at, she is existing as herself within how Amabel feels about her. So Hypo's words about I am more in love with you, or I'm still in love with you, or whatever the kind of, not so significant phrase is that he uses, that being on the page where she can sort of set it aside and dissect it and remove it, as opposed to I love you being on the mirror when she sees herself. To me, that's like the defining image of the novel, is that, or this chapter volume, is that she can see herself within the I love you that Amabel offers. And in fact, it reinforces her sense of self. And then that's sort of fascinatingly repeated when she's, that first time we see her with Hypo and they don't succeed in that room. But when Hypo tells her she's pretty on page 231 and that he wishes she could see herself, then she, with the eyes of Amabel and with her own eyes opened by Amabel, she saw the long honey-colored ropes of hair framing the face that Amabel found beautiful in its Flemish Madonna type. So when Hypo wants her to see her own beauty, she can see it because Amabel has made that accessible to her. And I think that's really one of the first times we actually know even what color her hair is. And I think again, going all the way back to Pointed Roofs, if you all recall, when she gets her hair washed and she's so distraught because she doesn't want to go downstairs because she can't style it very, well. And there's this self-consciousness about her body as not fitting into femininity, that she doesn't typically fit in these kind of feminine expectations. And I think she's fascinated with these women's hairstyles and things because she's observing different ways that women do that. And here it seems that she finally is sort of, oh, this is where I fit in. This is, and she can see herself. And yes, so Karen saying, name Amabel means lovable. That's wonderful. And wasn't the mirror message written with soap? Exactly. With soap seen in Oberlin? Oh yeah, that's wonderful. Do you want to?
There's actually soap. Soap appears throughout the book, and it plays a minor but supporting role. Even in Pointed Roofs, when they arrive in Holland, and she sees the sign Zeep, which is Dutch for soap.
Yes. Oh, that's so good. Wonderful. So perhaps, gosh, there's so much more we could say, but maybe just to kind of close out that, right? She has these encounters with Amabel, and then she does have the culminating moment with Hypo, right? And again, it's just so distinctly different from her descriptions when she's either with Amabel or thinking about Amabel. So he comes through the window, and on page 257, I mean, the wording's really intriguing, and very Miriam, because she describes it as the unwelcome adventure of her body, to be thus hovering outside and above it in a darkness that obliterated the room and was too vast to be contained by it. An immense, fathomless black darkness through which, after an instant's sudden descent into her clenched and rigid form, she was now traveling alone, on and on, without thought or memory or any emotion, save the strangeness of this journeying. So in a moment where she should be most in her body, she's out of her body, right?
Well, you know, it's almost like, it's maybe inappropriate for me to say as a man, but, you know, accounts that I've read about women of the experience of being raped, that often they leave their body because it's just so, you know, that's the only way they can maintain their sanity in the violence of what's going on. And it's almost, I mean, this kind of description is what you would read of those, like the Alice Sebold book.
Right. No, I think that's absolutely true. Right. This is not a moment of romantic bliss.
No.
Not by any means. Yes. And for me, this is closely connected, of course, to the conversation that they do end up having in daylight subsequently, on page 238, where Hypo says, you want a green solitude, an infant, then you'd be able to write a book. And Miriam has emphasized, I mean, yeah, it's like so silly. But she's emphasized multiple times, and particularly in this book, in kind of striking ways, that he's all about becoming, and he's all about like, well, what the person could potentially be, not just who are they in themselves. Like, he doesn't want to recognize, she says he could recognize the part of him and acknowledge it that actually could understand her, but that he chooses to instead focus on what is her potential, not just who she is, what is she going to achieve, which that seems to be very clearly on display here with, you know, you want an infant, the result, the kind of product of having a physical intimacy would be a child. And he also similarly wants her to produce a book, to like, don't just, you know, observe your life, create something, come up with something. But when she does, she writes something that doesn't have the teleology that a plotted novel is supposed to have, right? So she does write a novel of sorts, but one which completely resists that emphasis on what's the point here? What has been learned? How are the characters changing or growing? What is the plot development? And she just writes an endless series of experiences in which that's absolutely not the point. So I just kind of love how those two things really merge in this volume.
Yeah, I love that, because he repeats it twice, actually. In fact, the second time it's just, here's the formula, you know, criticism, which you do, middles, criticism, infant, novel. And it's like the scene in The Graduate where the guy just says, one word, plastics. That's the answer to your life, plastics.
Mm-hmm.
Here's my formula, you know, criticism, infant, novel.
Yes.
Just jumping around a bit, I just wanted to say, I absolutely love the end of Dawn's Left Hand. So that last passage where she meets the man in the hansom, and then she has this incredible feeling of power, and it all comes together. And the final words about inward song and wishing for congratulations, that, you know, coming out of all of this and the discomfort of a lot of it, and the kind of alienation of some of it, is nevertheless this real triumphant feeling at the end. So it kind of carries you. It's the stepping stone. I haven't begun the next chapter volume yet, but I feel like, as with Oberlin, we're sort of getting pitched forward into whatever comes next. I may be completely wrong about that, but it feels like we're on the doorstep here, and there's a sort of things have come to fruition at this point. It just felt very uplifting after some of the sort of struggles coming to this point.
Yes.
Yeah, immediate things had lost their hold. She really has a transition to a different kind of attitude. And it may be that essentially the illusion that sex is some transformative experience is lifted, and like that oppression, so to speak, is no longer hanging over her.
Yeah.
And certainly all the literature that she would have read, and Ouida more than anybody, the romantic love, you know, when you find your perfect love, and you know, then your life is somehow better as a result of that. And now she can just put that away.
Yeah. I was trying to think, there's a particular passage where she does attribute a change in herself to Hypo, but I think you're right. It could be this connection or doing this has enabled her to have a sense of freedom. See if I could just find it real fast. Because she says on page 260, this morning's strange rich harvest belonged in a sense to him and demanded some kind of expressiveness. So she does attribute something to him. But a few pages later, also, he is as fatal to the feminine consciousness as it would be if it were articulate to his plan. So he hasn't conquered her or changed her, but she has had some kind of value, something of value in her experience from that she's going to make something of it. And I think looking at that final paragraph, we definitely see the kind of fruition of that. There's also the fact that, and I'm not entirely sure actually whether she already had Clear Horizon in mind as the title of the next volume, but the word horizon appears multiple times in those final pages of Dawn's Left Hand, when she's thinking about all my life since the beginning, I've left things standing on the horizon. And I'm a free lover. Of course, I'm a free lover, but not his, on the horizon. So there's this sense of kind of, you know, the dawning, I don't know, a dawning of a new phase of her consciousness, perhaps. I don't know. but yeah.
No, I mean, it's you do get a sense that, especially if you've read the whole book and you know how she is transitioning now from the routine of her London life to trying to focus on her writing and all that. Yes. You really see the preparation for that happening. Whether or not she intended it to come out this way, it's definitely there in the last pages of the book.
Mm-hmm.
Well, also she's giving a little catalog and a revisiting of. She talks about the girls, the different girls she's been through and the different places she's been, and she even revisits her mother's suicide, and it's almost like you wonder. So this is the 15th, 16th year since she started this, and I don't know how many readers who started with the first one are still here. So I imagine it was rather confusing for some people who haven't read it all in the last 10 months, right? Even if I'd read it 15 years ago, I would have been confused. And again, it's that feeling of Dorothy's sense of time. Sometimes I feel like it does kind of slip into Miriam and back again, that she kind of lifts up the corner of the curtain just for a minute to almost to look to see how the dollhouse is doing and then closes it again. I just feel like she's peeking in at us at moments that are important to her. She just can't help it. She just has to make sure the audience is there. Okay, there, boom, you know. I just thought it was really interesting, all those reminiscences that she goes through near the end.
Yeah, and you'll see more of them in Clear Horizons. There is a lot of leave taking place in Clear Horizon, where she brings back parts and characters from her past come in and are essentially taken away. But also, I just wanted to jump in because Phyllis reminded me the remarkable scene about where she sees in an earlier volume, she talks about the little street where they had the Teachin's tea shop that reminded her of her mother and her mother's suicide. And she goes down that street again here in this book and essentially says it doesn't have its power anymore, which is, just fascinating. That's another, really huge transition of essentially realizing that there is an end to a trauma.
Yes. So I want to be mindful of the time. Are we?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Does anyone have any other questions or comments that they want to offer about Dawn's Left Hand while we have Crescent with us? And thank you so much for especially cracking the mystery of the first person. We've been chasing that one. I thought it was on a bicycle ride in the tunnel, I think, but yeah, now we're going to have to go back and look through it again.
One thing I would like to, and maybe you could follow up later. It just seems like she's really talking about writing a lot in this. I mean, it's even more so than in Oberland. And again, back to that description of Alma Bell's writing with no margins and the words.
Yes.
But she also talks about, I think novelists that I know, that Hypo and Alma know, they think it's just a way to get more leisure, and so it's just something to put a seed in the thought for the next discussion. We don't need to, but it did strike me.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Any other comments or questions that folks want to offer?
I knew it sounded like somebody wanted to talk about Wagner, which I'm always happy to do if we want to add on to that.
Oh, the Flying Dutchman, going to the opera, you mean?
Yes, yeah,
Yes.
because I mean, this is the third time that Wagner comes up within Pilgrimage, and each time there's something very significant about his music. I mean, anytime she talks about music, there's something significant going on. But since we had talked briefly about James, one of the connections I sort of make here is she listens to Cinta's spinning song, right? And she completely believes that there's something Wagner has gotten right about this representation of womanhood here. Right, it's see where that quotation is. It's so lovely. Oh goodness, why don't I have it? Cinta's little spinning song, heard in its setting, flowed forth from this knowledge. It prevailed against the earlier roaring of sea music and would prevail against the din and fury of life in which she was to be caught. Singing to herself over her wheel, she was truth. Singing her sunlight and her being and her happiness. And to me, that just felt very starkly different from when she criticizes James's inability to represent women, and that she's enjoying James until she realizes, gosh, the way he's representing Mariah Godstree, I think is her name. She just can't keep enjoying James in that same sort of blissful indulgence when she thinks too much about how he can't represent women. So I thought, I mean, this is obviously a very different medium, but she seems to think that Wagner captures something about the day-to-day existence of this woman character, the sunshine and the happiness, which made me think of Miriam herself, like the joy that Miriam takes in her own day-to-day experience. And so that was just something that I enjoy, but obviously it's there's a lot to be
No,
said.
that's a great point. Not many people would have, cited Wagner for his depiction of women.
Right. No, exactly.
So that's striking, but also, there are a number of points in this book where she observes like maids or the housekeeper at Wimple Street, Mrs. Cameron, where she's observing them and saying, that essentially they are getting pleasure from their chores, which is kind of a new, there's earlier, I want to say it's in the tunnel or maybe interim, but where she observes women in the East End and kind of dismisses them as drudges. And now she's kind of like saying, well, actually I can see, there's, pleasure and duty, or there that there's something like that going on. Well, thank you, Crescent, for taking this time to share some wonderful impressions about Dawn's left hand and pilgrimage and the infinite riches of this text, which is just amazing. I think we're all coming away with the impression, and with every discussion and every exposure to a new chapter volume, that this is a book that can be mined and mined and mined again, because it is so full of stuff, and it's not direct. It's not like it's rich of things that are laid out. There are things that you have to work for, to find and see and observe, and the observations I think that everybody brings to these discussions helps illuminate those.
Absolutely. Yes. Well, it was my pleasure to just the chat, anybody who's willing to talk with me about pilgrimage, it's like, okay, yes, let me be part of this. Because you just don't really get that chance. I think in my bio, I mentioned I did share it with some of my undergraduate students, and like, what a thrill for me, like making them have to talk to me about it for
Right.
multiple class sessions. But you don't really come across people who can just have a conversation. So this is just absolutely delightful. And thank you all for reading so closely and your excellent input. And it just has been a pleasure to be with you.
Okay. Thank you so much. I'll stop the recording now, and